it's some uneasiness associated with a delivery of an inaugural lecture, which is intended to celebrate what you've done as an academic. Nevertheless, as was indicated by the Vice-Chancellor and Chair, I attained the professorship in 2018, so I can take some solace in the fact that around that time, the economy was not in such turbulence. That notwithstanding, with my current position as the government statistician and therefore a policy advisor to the government, I feel very obliged that I put this inaugural lecture in a context. And what I intend doing today is to make reference to the more compelling reason why we need to look at this inaugural lecture in a different perspective. Last week, thankfully, Ghana hosted the annual general meeting of the African Development Bank. And one of the things that His Excellency the President indicated was, which appeared in both national dailies, that is Graphic and Times, was the fact that we need to build African economic models. We need to build African economic models. So as I reflected on the topic, data policy transitions, that has been something that I've been thinking about over the period, simply because of my research experience as a development microeconometrician, and also as the public servant in charge of official statistics. I said, use this platform to entwine what I call the chasm between data use, between academics and policymakers. Colleagues, whether we like it or not, there is a deep difference, chasm, between academics and policymakers. There is always a blame game. When we write, they don't listen, and they also say that they don't know what policy is. So I said to myself, I'm going to entwine my celebration of my life as an academic with a deep reflection on how to bridge that gap between academics and policy makers. Distinguished listeners, the other thing that I want to do is, before I share with you my outline, there are two questions that are defining my next career life. So beyond just celebrating, I want to share with you what I'm going to do in the next phase of my career life with two questions and my assessment of our perspectives on four things. One is conceptualization of national policies, issues of practice and policy, which thankfully, with a platform that was provided to me by the Vice-Chancellor of the Central University, Professor Bill Blampo, I carefully explored that terrain and identified the weaknesses in our policy making, and therefore what I term as the weaknesses leading to Ghana being an outcome-oriented country. The second dimension beyond the conceptualization is what I'm going to do today. And clearly in that lecture, I did indicate that I'm not going to interrogate the numbers. So today what I'm going to do is to interrogate the numbers in the context of my life as an academic, mainly in the area of microfinance, what I've been able to do, and what I bow my head in shame. When the Vice-Chancellor was reading my profile, he said, X number of research publications and 4 policy briefs. I keep asking myself as academics, should it always end at publications? The end result is policymakers accepting what we do. This is the time for us to stop the blame game. And this is exactly what I want to do in this lecture, the data policy transitions, an assessment of how we are thinking. From my lecture at the Central University, it was obvious that any macroeconomic variable that you think about in this country, any macroeconomic variable, be it GDP, be it interest rate, that is a macroeconomic variable that is determined by the market, not a policy, not a government-oriented macroeconomic variable like minimum wage. Any macroeconomic variable that you think about, within the last 2 decades, you see a turning point of more than 5 times. What that means is that there are stark volatilities in these macroeconomic variables. And with those volatilities, you cannot make any predictions, and this is basic economics that we teach at the level 100, level 200. For any economy to grow, you should have what we call a steady state growth path. Your capital and output should grow in a constant rate so that you can predetermine the outcome of policies. But all our macroeconomic variables in the last 2 decades are extremely volatile, a minimum of 5 turning points, peaks and troughs. Ghana, as one of my academic mentors would say, is not an outcome-oriented country. There are clear contradictions in our GDP, which is our central macroeconomic variable, and all other macroeconomic variables. And in that lecture, I said one thing. What is happening with employment, GDP, is something that we need to really be concerned about, and I'm going to show you more of that. 25% of the people are in the formal sector, and they are producing 3/4 of our output. It means 3/4 of those in the informal sector are producing only 1/4 of our GDP. I keep saying that we know the rhetorics of Ghana's economy, but we don't know the extent of Ghana's economy. And that is what I seek to do with data. For some reason, we've been forced to work with a macroeconomic toolbox. If you come to Ghana Statistical Service since whatever years ago, it's the same set of macroeconomic variables that we think about. Go to Bank of Ghana, go to all the places that we make decisions. And I argued in that lecture, and I'm going to argue further in this lecture, that toolbox, one, is not exhaustive, and two, that toolbox is not reflective of our country. So if indeed the President, His Excellency, has indicated that we need to build African economic models, I'm giving hints on the kinds of things that we need to look at in this lecture. The micro-macro linkages, which I'm going to highlight with distribution inequalities, clearly shows that the macro will be doing well. And I said in that lecture, people keep asking me, and that's the question that I get most from the media. What is GDP? What does it mean to Ghanaians? What is inflation? What does it mean to Ghanaians? Because we've treated data only at the aggregate level, and today I'll begin to let us think about looking at this macroeconomic indicator at the aggregate level, at the disaggregated level, and see how GDP affects your decision making, even when you are paying somebody, an artisan who is working for you. If we don't know the average hourly earnings, why would somebody, an artisan, say that I'm charging 100 Ghana cedis, 200 Ghana cedis for a day's work? When we don't have any conversations around our minimum wage simply because it's to that extreme. Then I make the argument that our policy-making process has been centralized. I strongly advocate for an eclectic approach where academics will not just put in policy recommendations and just sit there, and Vice Chancellor, previous Vice Chancellors, thank you for that opportunity for secondment to simply go out there, get closer to them, and begin to change the kinds of things that they do. In as much as it's limited, I believe that some impact is being made. So at the time that we had a platform to influence the Ghana microfinance policy, one of the strong recommendations was do not put the Microfinance and Small Loan Center at the office of the President. Distinguished listeners, we still have it there. As to whether microfinance is making impact in Ghana or not, academically we've proven it based on the p-value. But with our poverty rate, based on the GLSS 7, still at 23.4%, about 6.8 million people who are poor, it's still a matter of concern whether microfinance is really making an impact. So my thinking around 2014, 2015 drifted to the kind of research that we do, and more importantly, the data that we use. So I said, pass on the legacy of research to your PhD student. So the last 2 papers that we are celebrating today, still around the issues of microfinance, is really the pass-through effect. So one of the papers talked about bundling financial products. Don't give credit alone, don't give savings alone. See how you can design thresholds. Think about the calibrations that I talked about. At what levels of savings would you give this amount of credit? At what level of remittances would you give this amount of credit? At what level of savings would you say the client should go into microinsurance? Indeed, that paper was groundbreaking and found its way into the Journal, again, of Development Studies. And last of the series of impact of microfinance is a publication with one of my PhD students where we received an award for her PhD, the debt overhang associated with microfinance. We celebrate the Bank of Ghana's decision to clean up the microfinance sector. At some point, we had over 3,000 microfinance institutions. Thankfully, the number has been trimmed down to under 1,000. We celebrate this because most of our papers made reference to the number. In this particular paper, we're not saying it's a proliferation of microfinance institutions that is problematic, but the characteristics of the institutions and their targets. And indeed, those days I told the practitioners, we know what you are doing. You get into this market, exhaust all their resources. When they are not able to pay, you move into another market. So you got to a time where the clients also knew this. Irrespective of your interest rate, they take your loan and they move to another area. So the market got saturated. So as a people, we were deceiving ourselves. Having talked about this, I move on to distinguished listeners, think about this. If you get earnings, you send remittances, it affects consumption, expenditure. So by the time it gets to consumption expenditure, you would have reduced the extent of inequality that you have in the system. Income data is pretty much noisy. So Ghana Statistical Service, we are always careful putting out that data. So the first issue that I put across is, should we not put out the data simply because of our inability to collect the data correctly? This is what takes me to the realm of data biases. So I said, use this lecture to get people to understand the extent of inequality that we have. So I get data from the Controller and Accountant General Department, earnings disaggregated into basic salary and allowances. What this graph tells us is that once you have a 45 degrees line from the origin, it talks about a situation of perfect equality. Once you see the curvature concave to the 45 degrees line, it talks about the extent of inequality. So the inequality that we've been measuring in Ghana is the 0.42, which is the latest figure that we have. And look at this. If you look at our coordinated program of economic and social development policies, you have these figures in there from a trend point of view, but unfortunately in the document, instead of saying it's consumption expenditure inequality, it says it's income inequality. How we are using statistics. Let's step back. Look at the extent of inequality from an income and an earnings point of view. So what I did was take that earnings only from the public sector, calculate the inequality, remove outliers, take away those getting over 100,000 and so on. The least inequality that you get is 0.71. What becomes more worrying is if you look at the inequality from the allowances point of view, it's a state of perfect, near perfect inequality, 0.94. Anytime I think about allowances greater than earnings in an economy, we need to begin to rethink. And as I discussed this with colleagues, one prompted me that, note that this is only documented allowances. We can never get data on desktop allowances. But let's start the conversation on the data that we have. Vice Chancellor, the way data has informed work in UCC from a research point of view, we need to begin to think about measuring why colleagues have some inertia. Inequality is the basis of all our socioeconomic ills. If you look at this as an economic indicator and you get somebody attacking you on the street, it's because you did not discuss this. If you get sexually harassed in the office and you don't think about this because of the economic power disparities, inequalities is the bane. And from an economic point of view, we have shown in this country that when our growth rate in 20, that is during our GLSS 5, had to impact on poverty, because of the inequality, it impacted only by 0.17. As if that was not enough. That was when our consumption expenditure inequality was just about 0.41. When our consumption expenditure inequality was 0.42, based on the 2017-2018 study, the growth that we recorded at that point only impacted on poverty by 0.07. So it wasn't only 0.17. Because of consumption expenditure, it dampened the effect of it reduced poverty by only 0.07. Can somebody tell me what is going to happen if we throw in the 0.94 on the effect of our growth rate? We're not going to see any effect. I move on to my second variable, productivity. Since I joined the service in 2019, every quarter I'm obliged to release GDP figures. And to be honest, sometimes mentioning these figures in billions, I have to rehearse them at dawn before I bring them. The recent one, I sat on air and I said, nominal GDP 459 billion Ghana cedis, real GDP 175 billion Ghana cedis. Who cares? How do people relate with these numbers? And with the kind of economics that we teach in the university, one of the basic things that Dr. Ibn would not miss at the undergraduate level is total productivity. Look at your inputs, look at your outputs. So I said, begin that conversation on productivity, because if you want to increase that 459 billion by even 10 billion, it depends on how much we are getting on a monthly basis, on an hourly basis, on a weekly basis. So in this lecture, what I've done is to put together the GDP data and to put together the GDP data with the census data. Look at our population, those employed, and I narrow down to what we teach at the basic level, what we call the income identity. Basic economics. What people earn should be equal to their output and should be equal to what they spend. Let's look at what is happening in terms of monthly data. Earnings only from the public sector is about 3,420 Ghana cedis. On the average, output per person is about 1,420, depending on whether you use just the number of people or discount it based on the number of hours. So we see twice the difference between our output and our earnings. I didn't speak so much about the data on expenditure because it's captured at the household level, so the unit of analysis should be looked at carefully. But once I see this, at a time that people are talking about neutrality allowance, our earnings are twice our output. There's something basically wrong. And this is coming from our formal sector. So when I got a privilege to host the UTAG executives nationally on our single spine, which was led by our own president, I said to him, go and do the analysis well. It's too early for us to think about comparisons between the public sector and the private sector. Because within the public sector, as I showed to you earlier on, there's inequality of about 0.71 once I throw out all the outliers. If you think about it from the perspective of productivity, the public sector productivity is more than the national average, that is 3,420 earnings within the public service, as against 1,420. Let's get our orientation, our conceptualization, our approach to issues clearly. Because the government's remit on the public sector is definitely more impacting than what it can do on the on the private front. I'm hoping that the UTAG took that and did something about it. Distinguished listeners, I turn to the third variable. I say to my colleagues that as a development economist, I feel so uncomfortable defining unemployment in a heavily informal economy. Keep in mind that 3/4 of our economy is informal. And going to people asking them, over your reference period, in the case of the census, in the last 7 days, did you work for 1 hour? And if you didn't work, were you available for work? And were you seeking for work? Then you do this and you get 13.4%, and we want to celebrate. This is what I call the politicization of statistics. Ghana's unemployment can simply not be 13.4. But for the sake of international benchmarks, ILO put this out there. We've been using this. Thankfully, in the wisdom of the service, in 2013, they said, let's vary this a little bit. Think about the 3 indicators that I talked about. I did not work for at least 1 hour in the last 7 days. I was available and I sought for work. You qualify as unemployed. Then in the wisdom of the service in 2013, they said we cannot continue this way. So let's distinguish between strict and relaxed definition, which ILO had recognized. So they put 2 perspectives to unemployment, what they call the strict and the broad. So in 2013, we varied our approach from the strict definition to the broad definition. When I had the privilege of announcing the census results, the calls that I was getting was, is your measure consistent with international standards? I said, yes, sir. I did not have bravery that, although it's consistent, it's not reflective of our economy. But for purposes of this lecture, which I will not be questioning, I put on this slide unemployment plus vulnerable employment. This is an experimental statistics. This is not national statistics. As I said, it's not a press release. If you think about people who have contract to work and the number of hours worked, and you play around this in whatever academic scientific way you want to play around it, you need to think about unemployment plus vulnerability of employment at something around 49%. Unless we appreciate the reality of our economy, tackling our development will be far off. Distinguished listeners, I'm not gladdened to put out the figure 49%. My focus is on the distribution across regions. How would we ever think about the OT region having the least unemployment rate when it's one of the poorest regions in the country, simply because all of them are engaged in some agricultural activity? Interrogating the numbers that we have. So you see the districts, how they fall off across the different regions. So once you use vulnerable plus unemployed, now it's Greater Accra that has the least unemployment plus vulnerable instead of OT region. And you don't have all the districts in OT region being below the 13.4, but you have a split across the 9 districts in the OT region. Let's face the realities. Distinguished listeners, I move to the second. Ghana's rate of inflation is currently 23.4, and it's attracted a lot of concerns. One of the concerns is the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have discussed this at various levels, and I thought, again, it's our appreciation of the use of data. There is some noise with this data because we are looking at the volume of imports that Ghana receives. We see Ghana in there simply because some of the goods, especially fuel, gets in, some value added is put to it before it gets to the customs for them to do the designation. But this is some cleaning that we can do to the data. But once you look at this data, and you look at what we are getting from Russia and Ukraine, which is about which is in the 5th or the 6th position, I ask myself, where would our inflation be if Russia had invaded China? 15%, 16%, 13%. It's no good when you come to the first 3 months of the year. As much as about a third of the volume, of the value of the imports that we are getting. Then for some reason, it could be a data issue. In March, we see that of China drop. And I'm asking myself, is this because of what is happening in Shanghai? Because of the virus? And if it is, it's clearly a sense of how vulnerable we are as a country. Our vulnerability is further deepened when you look at trade vulnerability not from a value point of view, but commodities that we rely on only one country for it. So for commodities that we rely on only one country for it, China constitutes 22.4% of it. Again, discount what is happening in Ghana. India doesn't come up when it comes to the value, but from a single commodity point of view, 15% is coming from India. So capital flight simply defined are monies that are in Ghana and end up elsewhere. It's a difficult conversation to have because there are legal means in getting these monies out there and there are illegal means in getting these monies out there. Data on the illegal means is a challenge. Because of the challenge, shouldn't we talk about it? When the data that we are seeing here is that in 2010, capital flight was 20.8% of our GDP. I'm not a macroeconomist, but a person who deals with numbers, I said to myself, if capital flight at some point constituted 20% of your GDP, why this conversation on inflation and exchange rate? Why do you want to think about bridging, improving your tax GDP ratio when people make money here and the next minute is that it goes out there? As if the levels are not troubling. What kind of data do you want to present? For me, this is not only about the levels, it's about the volatilities. You can't plan if at some point your capital flight is 20% and at some point your capital inflows, that is why we see the negatives, are more than your capital outflows. We simply don't have a grasp of our economy. These are the 5 variables that, in my mind, are missing from the policy discourse of this country. If you engage, it will be admitted that it is important, but the challenge is how do you capture it? We've allowed international communities, individuals, to capture this data and using them as basis to judge, to send in foreign direct investment based on this data. I'm hoping that the transition from Department of Economics to School of Economics and the setup of the School of Economics Development Fund would help interrogate these issues very well. My last of the 5 issues. Look at the disparities in prices across these markets. So during the last release, I said that if you want to resolve the inflation rate in Ghana, is not a monetary policy argument. And thankfully, the Bank of Ghana, the governor of the central bank, did indicate that we should begin to think about the supply side. Data on stocks of grains is yet to be compiled. But it is necessary because, as I indicated, food contributes 50% of our overall inflation. The human factor in the variations in our prices during economic turmoils are pretty significant. 2018, nothing was happening. You see the stability in prices across the 54 outlets. During the COVID-19 pandemic, you see the variations And during the Russia invasion of Ukraine, you see stark variations across the 54 markets, with some outlets selling a 5 kg of imported rice, specifically Gino rice, over 108 Ghana cedis. I took the pain to check just last week, and it's just 63 Ghana cedis somewhere in Accra. I did say in my last release that households have been deprived of information on prices. Indeed, if you take the data on Cape Coast outlets alone, 5 of them, Cape Coast outlets alone, you see a variations in excess of 100%.